When doing Sargent studies, if you ever get to see these in person, one of the things you want to be careful is they are overwhelming. So not to forget that, well, it's just a sketch, number one. It's just a study. And that you should be bringing your own take. So it's that judging part, how we judge our work, our expectations, to have a level of expectation and a little more clarity with what it is we are trying to achieve with this study. For me, looseness is always probably the biggest thing that I want to work on. Just achieving that confidence, level of looseness, the connection to the subject, but then to the understanding of my thought process. How do I control my mind, which sometimes can just take over. And as you know, we have ways of dealing with sometimes, let's call it stress, the stress of the challenge. So it's achieving a bit of better control over those thoughts, and how I big diagonal here. How I can, with practice, understand that part of my work a little bit better. So it's understanding how we think our way through these problems. All right, so we have lots of information here. I want these lines to be loose, so notice my grip. I am using a mechanical pencil. For this early part of the sketch, the lead is HB, but I want to grab it as long as possible, and I'm going to let that line, that loose line, really begin to develop what I call that line quality that hopefully will show just a little bit here and there in this watercolor. Begin to slow it down and begin to connect just beyond. Didn't really do an envelope fully. There's so many negative space, and that's why for me this one, as I use that word, becomes a little more of an intuitive blind contour drawing. The key is going to be, how do I deal with the level of detail? Once again, this is one where I am going to want to take it a little bit further than I usually do, because the work with color is going to be a little more measured. There's going to be more pause and planning and mixing. And also, in order to achieve the techniques that I want with these glazes and layers of light and shadow, white preserved and all these different things, visualizing and always thinking, how are these lines going to serve me later on? So I'm starting to get a little carried away with this angle here. I want to make sure I don't lose connection too. And that's what I was looking for. The shoulder, this part of the shoulder, and how it just lines up right at the tip of this foot here. So once I see that, and I begin to see the proportion of it, I can then sort of begin that envelope approach, and a little more of a linear study that may seem, and what it actually is, just a study of angles. Trying to really capture, there's a little bit of beautiful foreshortening here and a nice reading of perspective. So this head and the way it occupies space, looking down, but it also, with the juxtaposition of the arm, doesn't look towards us. It's actually looking almost profile. So we want a good understanding of that in order for it to achieve and capture that pose, the full pose. The head has a lot to do with it. The angles of the big joints, the shoulders. But negative space answers a lot of questions here. If you're familiar with your anatomical figure drawing, bringing some of that back, for example, if you remember the bean. So we have a little bit of a bean going on here where I could see not the center line, but the center line on the back. And I want to bring that just a little bit into play while still focusing mostly on straight line studies. All of these lines are going to be rearranged, polished, sharpened, detailed in due time. So stage one, really beginning to, it's a general look, overall look, but we begin to get more and more familiar. And it is that phrase, that sense of connection to the subject that we're looking for here, which is you almost want to embody the pose. You want to feel what the weight of the leg here and the knee. So notice that the knee just doesn't point forward. It actually points out, outside of the hip. So that is what I mean by embodying. This is going to have to be lower. And when you think about these, it's not just the XY coordinates. You have the X, Y, Z. So what's going back and what's coming forward adds literally a whole new dimension to your work. So knowing how to read the lines, here we go, the lines that gives us the shapes, and those shapes as they give us the form, our sense of the form and how it occupies that space. Beginning to look maybe a little bit short here. So got a little bit ahead of my line study here. And again, that's one of those things that you really need to, it's you being your own teacher, catching yourself. Am I getting ahead of myself? Am I still at stage one? Then why did I just go a little bit beyond where I was supposed to be and making those corrections? That's what I mean by enhancing your, in terms of skill, it's more of the thought process and how you handle the strategy, how you break down what is in front of you and have the discipline and the patience big words there, discipline and patience, to stick to the task at hand. I'm going to have to zoom in just a little bit more, make sure I capture these lines the way they really are. And there's more information. I'm going to be revisiting lots of areas here because we do have lots of play with some of these beautiful shapes. And I start light. I see Sargent's hand, and in a way I'm looking not so much at his line, but I am looking at a bit at that layering, how he broke down stages of this drawing. And I will revisit and have my own take, which in this case, it somewhat is that right now, my own take, and then add a little contrast, a little heaviness to the line, a little more form to the overall. So what we usually would call detail. A little more S and C shape, curvatures, so more anatomical as we get from simple to more complex. That would be the simplest way to put it. And you begin to see it gets from light to a little darker. And this is what I was looking for here. All the clues that negative space can give us. So this beautiful little shape here of negative space that really brings together. This, to me, one of the poses, this leg, and the way we angle it, the way we capture sort of that, I mentioned it before, the weight. How would you capture the weight? And remember, all of the weight, obviously it's on the other leg, so it becomes a little more stiff, more straight. But this one, half a bit on the air, we see the muscle, we see the knee kind of floating, and just not forward again. I'm trying to capture that roundness while I'm still focusing on straight line study. Making sure I see those lines, see the angles. And before I get into detail here, again, lots of temptation. When you begin to reach areas such as the hand or feet, these feet here, beautiful drawing, the possibilities to simplify. You have to be very, very disciplined. So rule number 1 would be, don't use the word foot or heel or toe. Instead, isolate just the simplest thing you see. Line, the shape, direction, quality of that line that then gives you a shape, making sure you capture those shapes as best as possible. And that's how you create that illusion. Unbelievable work here with the light, shadow, all the form that just happens here. It's one of my favorite areas. Also because you have that contrast with Medusa's hip and abdomen coming here together. That shadow with all the beautiful light that we see on in this entire area. And it also gives you that sense of what's happening to the pose of the leg, because we see the top of the foot, but we also see a little bit of the bottom of it. So there's the weight issue that I mentioned before, how it just leans, turns, and it's all about angles and the quality of capture the angles of those lines. So that's where I would spend most of my time, and I will just move on for now. Come back to it. But if you look at this watercolor and you see the beautiful quality of line and the way it mixes with the watercolor work, it does achieve that perfect sense of balance. And it is, in one word, confidence. And where does that come from? It's from understanding. from asking the right questions and then having the very confident answer to that question. Another area where it is incredible how, with the folds and some of this, he deals with the lines and the light. And I'm just going to take this, and without too much rendering here, I do see the form, we see the torso, we see the breast. Just trying to capture that pose. And notice how there's not as much, although there is work, and there's beautiful flesh and muscle, and the pose is rendered. There's not that much heavy or attention to detail, calling the attention to this area. It's more of a, this is actually too small in reference to the size. And that's where, once again, make a correction. Where do I need to be here? And I'm lining it up with a knee. And this area here, points, again, another beautiful negative space shape here. And that's where you take your line study and then maybe shift your drawing method to adapt to the information presented. So a couple of takes on this. But as I begin to zoom out and see how this is working, I lost a little bit of the bottom here. So my proportion was not, I should have made it a little bit smaller. And that is, again, from the intuitive drawing. As you're there, you get your sketch. I did have that feeling early on. I rearranged, tried to resize, and it still, once again, was a little bit too big. So those are the mental notes I'm going to take. And I tend to do that. Honestly, that is one of the things that I still struggle with, and you should pay attention when we have issues like that. How and when, at what moment, what step did I skip? What could have helped me achieve, if you're having those issues, a better understanding, a better planning, a better visualization. So moving up a little bit. Doing a little bit of line study, but we're trying to capture the curve with this one here. It's a nice element that completes the other side. We see the sword, the tip of it, which gives us the gesture of the torso, the arm, the other arm, the one we don't see. Because we can imagine how it's holding. And as I work my way back up, now I really want to clean up, I don't know if that's the right word, but some of this quality. It should, most people would say, well, why didn't you capture it on the first one? Remember, I was working with general proportion. So just a quick study, which is not emphasized. It's biggest, simplest. Now I begin to add a little more complexity. So I break the line and I add a little bit of gesture. a little bit of form. So beyond the shape that these lines are trying to create, I'm trying to add a little bit of form to it. And it's mostly anatomical. I'm reading the way the muscle and it's all SC shapes basically. Beginning to see a little better structure. I'm wondering now if I should go right into the face, and I think I should. There's so much information in and around to process all of this. And I'm also giving myself, as I usually do, bits of clues, sort of that light map that we see coming soon. And then answering the question, how did I go from here to here to here? Why? Well, it's completing, again, without losing sense of the whole or focusing too much on one area. How does one area help complete the other? How does it make it easier to see, and which piece helps me put that puzzle together easier? So I'm going to try to zoom in as much as I can. I'm going to try to do that here actually. And there we are. So using the image, and when I zoom in like this, it is incredible to see the actual movement and gesture that Sargent had going on, the understanding. And you could begin to see how his eyes were glued to the subject, and how every line, every angle reads almost perfect, captured. I gotta lighten up some of these lines. Remember, as they get smaller, if they get darker and sharper, it becomes more of a focal point. And although this is a big focal point, always the face, the eyes, the features, we want to make sure I want to make sure I handle it a little bit better with pencil line, and more so with watercolor. So they're very strategic. And the way he really just captures the expression. If you can see and feel the movement of the hand, how he navigated. This is why you want to study masters, to pick up on some of these things and really take time. And time means also looking closer, emulating, but doing a really nice simplified analysis of the quality of that line. Even the number of lines sometimes. Notice how the nose is like 1, 2, 3 lines just on the profile of it. And underneath, yeah, you have what seems like the shadow, the nostril, but it's also just a kind of a scribble. For the eye, same thing. You have the perfect shape, size, and in many ways you also have the value of that line, a little bit of shift in terms of tiny bits of contrast with the gauge of the line. And then look at these beautiful S shapes on the hair. Lots of S shapes, C shapes, line patterns. And at some point, it's understanding why masters are masters. And it is, look at that simplicity. It really almost, some of these lines look like the lines of a 2-year-old. They have that, what I call sort of the truth in them. That energy, that feeling. And that confidence, again, the word, that confidence. That only comes from trusting what you see and knowing that you're here just to have fun with it. Are you having fun with it? One thing I always want to point out, and I'll say it again and again and again, is how do you check if you are tight, if you are stiff? Well, your lines will show it. If they are, your lines will begin to show it. So when you begin to focus more and more on trying to achieve likeness, and you lose connection to what's actually there, the way you and only you could see it. I'm tapping some of this line because it got just a tiny bit dark. Go back to simplicity. Go back, fight. It's a struggle sometimes, and that is the struggle, to stay loose and loose in the mind. That looseness of mind, which means the looseness of how you're deciding to see, because you are saying, I mean, it depends. If you are really looking, then you're going to see. But then the process of analyzing and deciding what you choose to see that is actually there. There's sometimes a hiccup that happens where we go always back to that simplification. It's too simple. It's not based on what's there. It's based on what we think we know, where we begin to lose. What's the direction? What's the angle of the line? What's the gesture? Look at negative space. But I did mention early on, this is one where you really want to follow the hand of a master. And the more you can see and capture a line like he does, You'll find some satisfaction. And then to make them yours. Because I believe once you see it, you can't unsee it. Once you feel it, and you know the feeling, you're going to want it again and again and again. So knowing how to get there, that's the whole point. Having a plan, having a strategy, and it all starts with your expectations. I think that more than anything, maintaining sort of an understanding of what it is you're trying to do in this exercise. Number one, understanding that it is just an exercise. So that may take a little bit of that pressure off of you. And you may be saying, what pressure? In case there is feeling of pressure, and that generally would be when you put too much expectation. So it's managing the levels of expectation, understanding what the exercise or what the purpose of what you're doing is from the very beginning and throughout. So that's what I realized, that when we lose the connection, not just to the subject, but to the purpose of the exercise and how we manage those levels of expectation, that's where we could and generally run into trouble. And it's trouble that could add more pressure. And there is no need. There's a difference between managing a challenge, and I think that is one thing. Loose lines and how to maintain them. It sounds silly, but it is somehow finding a way to just really truly have fun with what you're doing. If you find a way where we could see that you were having fun, and it shows through the lines, and it shows through the way you played with color and the way you connected with the subject. It also depends a lot on what your style is, what the final look of it will be, or what you expect it to be. Because the truth is, no matter what you do, only you could have done it that way. So moving around just a little bit faster here and there, with finishing, just polishing some of these lines. And there are specific areas where some lines, as you can see, become really fundamental. Like as we talk structural and make or break the pose, hold the pose. Here's one, very subtle sometimes. They're not always harsh or obvious, but they are essential. And that is part of the job, really figuring out here at the lower part. There's one thing I really want to, before I move on to color, is that foot. The simplicity in the lines. Let's see if you're seeing it a little bit better right here. How I deal with some of the lines in this foot. Once again, you could see how he just reads through and breaks down some of the information. And you could literally count the lines, see the shape. So I had these straight line studies, and that's sort of basically what I'm going for in terms of managing the size and the proportion of this overall shape. But now I want to render with a little more clarity what we see, what I need to show. And it is going to be that smaller and more complex. A lot of it is not through line. It's, you could see it's through watercolor, light and shadow work. But there are some crucial lines here. And they're tiny and they're curved. But they really just complete. And again, are you still at the stage where you can make adjustments, corrections? Absolutely. The longer you keep your drawing open, and that's the term, you want to keep it open, as if it were still in stage one, the better chance you have overall. For satisfaction in the end. There we are. Checking some of these lines, and I said I'm going to keep this very basic, this area here. So I'm going to move a little bit past. There we are. And to here. With finalizing the drawing. Really want to point out again how, look at the solution for elbow, the line, the simplicity of these lines, and you see the double takes. If you look closely, how he captures not just all of the anatomical features, the form, light, but that beautiful gesture and the simplicity of it. And it almost is a minimalistic drawing. There's just 2-3 lines that describe almost an entire hand. And a hand that is actually in action, doing, gripping. I'm going to make this face just a little bit bigger and give her just a little more almost all through blind drawing here. And what I see will be, again, more of the watercolor. Work with light and shadow, very simple too. In terms of the amount of line. And what will show in the end through the color. And quick overlook, just looking to the overall, I think we are ready to mix our colors. So yes, that's the way I would approach the drawing. Did I go a little too heavy with the line? It's the way I wanted to approach it. I want some of these lines, I could have made maybe some of the lines towards the light a little bit softer. That would be one adjustment I would be willing to make right now. And what I mean by that is I'm going to work the edge, I'm going to work a little bit of background, but I do want some of the strength of the line to complement that watercolor. Okay. So for watercolor, I mentioned earlier, is it going to be limited palette? I have these colors here. I have cadmium yellow deep, which is almost an orange. Burnt sienna, which would be almost the replacement of my red, and ultramarine blue. And to this mixture, I want to bring in a purple, the dioxazine purple. And that is going to be how I'm going to play with the lights, shadows, some of the complements, and keeping it very basic. Some simple washes, a little more primary, just a little more primary in terms of the warmth and the temperatures. But I also want these to be very, very wet in terms of applying them straight to the palette and being able to also manage consistencies. Sometimes when you set your watercolors, if you have the tubes and you let them sit there, they get a little, just a little too hard. And adding more and more water to soften it up and get pigment, I feel you get lots of low value, but I want some of these to have that granulation that only comes from fresh pigment. And most of these are, I'm going to break down. There we are. Wet on dry and layered in somewhat of a, really want, just like I did with my drawing, I want the same sketch quality with the color. I want the color to have that same, follow the drawing basically. So, color swatches, if you feel like you don't have to follow the same color scheme or color harmony that I'm going to use, I want to stick to what I see him using. He may have used some turquoise as well. So the first color I want to make sure I test is how close to a green with this warm yellow and this ultramarine blue. What qualities of green am I going to achieve? Because it may get very muddy very fast. And I do see some of that showing up in some of the areas of the shadow. So, layering, I think the first one would be the background. And as I said, sticking to some of the primary color, not a lot of mix, using this cadmium yellow deep, I'm going to add a few lines just in the back here. And I mean lines, I'm going to add some just shapes of color. It actually could go into the figure just a little bit. So how do I deal with the light and the layers? Well, my method is through squinting, looking close first, and managing value. I want some of this to mix just a little bit into the actual reading of the light, especially here in the back, right up through the arm. And I'm going to be using soft edges. That's one of the things that when you see what he did, you have hard edges, soft edges, and some color blending. But mostly, what I see is layering. And these very soft, delicate layers. How you decide to manage. So in that same approach of layering colors, you may have some of the greens becoming optical through layering, not through mixing. And I'm kind of going a little bit close and over to the edges, softening. But all of it really trying to maintain that sketch quality. Now I'm looking as close as I can through different areas, making sure I don't overuse it, and begin to add soft layers where I'm going to see areas of shadow. That is also going to be layered, starting with yellow and then with the complementary, that purple, or a variation of it. Some of that, it's kind of that afternoon golden light that I'm trying to see here. Do a little lifting. Where I see those beautiful sepia tones and some of the harsh edges of line that I mentioned before. And soft into the face. But it takes that close looks. And somewhat breaking apart the layers, figuring it out. In a deconstructive way. Before I get too far with the figure, I do have a nice soft wash. I want this to be kind of not as a strong blue, but a little bit of a gray, so that touch of yellow that doesn't go too close to green, but just softens, neutralizes, grays it up a little bit with the complementary to bring it in here as you could see some of that just clear wash of sky. And I am letting it sort of just layer or blend. And maybe this one's just a little more blue than I had hoped. And maybe I'll treat it a little more as a wet on wet. So lay down just a little bit of water. And beginning to read, does it and how does it play with the light of the body? Just a few touches of variation in consistency. But one thing I begin to be careful about is preserving some of that light. So making sure I see soft edges, adding just a little more water. And in a somewhat abstract shape approach, I'm looking at some of the mixture here, trying to really begin to pull the light. And that's how I decide, not so much with, yes, color temperature, but a little bit of decisions on saturation. Creating contrast through saturation. So just pushing the values, especially here, you see the background clears up and we have a little bit of light, a lot of light actually, on this, on the chest. And it takes just a little bit of that. Mixing a little more color. So with this sketch, I also want to follow the rule of biggest, simplest. So a lot of these big light shapes, big warm, I want to give them just a little bit of time. So they can dry just a little bit better. But I love how it's already settling in. Where I could begin to just expand on those big shapes, make them a little bit smaller, a little more complex, and begin to pull out sharper edges, a little bit of juxtaposition. I'm going to introduce for the first time here a little bit of that sepia tone, and I'm going to create a mixture, a spectrum from that yellow to the sepia. I don't want it to be just or to pop up too harshly, too quickly. Let's see there. And once again, through a quick look where you would begin to see it. It's first squinting, and I'm going to start here at the top. There's a reed of blue, and there's a mix of that greenish blue, but I want to start nice. And here's a bit of a contradiction. I mentioned if we're sketching, wouldn't it be just sketched in, done? Why do we become a little more painterly? Meaning, if I have to revisit, that becomes more of painting approach than a sketching approach. So how would I deal with that? And that's exactly what I'm trying to do here. I'm trying to deal with first the warm areas, a bit of lifting, and trying to see if I can capture, is it that blue? And can I reach the level where from blue to gray I can handle and play with the light here. So going right into one of the toughest areas here. Not the biggest, simplest, but testing it where I see a lot of blend, a lot of mix right in the face. Maybe having to use a smaller brush, considering moving to a smaller brush. And through lifting, I'm using a paper towel here. Begin to achieve a little bit of variation. Of the light. So it was somewhat of a test. Let's take that a little bit further. And a little bit lighter. Starting with again, how we handle the light. And I think there, you see, if you could see that there, the way I begin to handle light and shadow here through the layering, it's about handling of temperature, and I'm trying to figure out, without having used the burnt sienna in this area for the shadows or the purples, where I would have more of that contrast. Taking a big risk here. Is this going to work? Is it going to read? And as I try to lower the value and preserve some of that light, that's where I need to be very careful. And I don't want it to be fully white, but somehow reach that level of low value. Not having, and the other thing is not having it blend or be confused with the background. So I believe I may be missing a cool yellow to bring this just a little bit more towards a turquoise. And create just a tiny bit more difference between the subject and the background. But the final test would be for this mixture to bring in that burnt sienna, and when the time is right, so depending on the level of moisture, bring in that technique. Wet on wet. Here we definitely want some sharper edges. And a little bit more play of light, simplicity with the shift in colors. So going just a little bit further into this shadow area of the back, I'm going to begin to mix a little more burnt sienna with that ultramarine blue and see if I can start. And this takes lots of very, very close looks at the light. So achieving some of that low value while also trying to preserve light in certain areas. And deal with technique. No better way to do this than with that sketching mentality. Switching back and forth, adding a little more blue. Adding a little more wet on wet. Preserving some of that layer of yellow, the golden light. And it's just a magnificent, just a beautiful combination of brush strokes, of full understanding of technique and light and form and anatomy. All of it just simultaneous. It's masterful. And strategy, of course. How all of this as it comes together in its simplicity, and you could see it in every brushstroke. It's full understanding of all of those things. And definitely a lot of patience to see, to read, to understand. To capture that magic moment of moisture that gives you that beautiful watercolor. Let's see, I'm going to introduce for the first time just a tiny touch of that violet, or the purple, I'm sorry. And it may be just a little early, but it's just to give me a hint of how that contrast is going to handle here, especially in these dark areas. Questioning the use of blue, but you see that it's mostly that temperature and how we work light and shadows with these complementing colors, that nice set, the color harmony, the color palette that you chose, and bringing the most out of it, light and shadow, through simple brush strokes. So I'm going to just begin to move the range between these warm yellows, what I call my red, in this case the burnt sienna, which would be my warmest color here. Still almost as a base layer. I am very tempted to just bring in a touch of this turquoise. By bringing a cool yellow. and hoping that it makes a bigger, just a tiny bit of a contrast between what's going on here and the background. See, that worked a little bit better. But then the temperature shifts a little bit. Making sure we continue to preserve that light. One of my favorite areas that I want to study here, this foot. I'm going to take that apart, really zoom in. Show you a little closer. So yes, layering, and the question of which is my first layer, which is the right color for the first layer. I'm going back to warm, very, very low value, as light as possible. I'm gonna have to wait till this dries. Lots of hard edges. And just a tiny bit of shift in the consistency of some of these colors. Maybe time almost to consider a smaller brush. And now bigger shapes of darker color, some of these shadows. It's becoming more and more wet on dry, and you could actually see the brush strokes. Let's bring in a little bit more burnt sienna. And in this case, it'll be a mixture of the three colors, my primary palette, which would be more of the burnt sienna, a tiny bit of ultramarine blue, and then the complement with that yellow. Trying to achieve the darkest gray or a black. And it doesn't really reach that level of black, but that would be my shadows right underneath. And where else do I see these? Just a touch, still too wet. And also still very wet here. You want some of that sharp edge to show, especially in and around the toes. But in these other areas, I would just go straight on wet on dry. A little bit of dry brush begins to show up as well. So pushing brush work and techniques with brush. And breaking these brush strokes smaller and smaller. So the big washes that I had early on here, covering those big big shapes. I'm going to go ahead and complete looking at the light mostly, or Medusa. And once again, these are mostly abstract shapes. You can't, I mean, we know it's a shoulder and it's a torso, but I just really want to stay away from that type of read and isolate, in this case, light, shadow. In terms of color temperature, what I read as light, shadow, and all the variations. A little bit of that layering with the warm colors I put down first, but still in a sense of biggest to simplest. I'm sorry, biggest to smallest and general to simple. A little bit of technique, softening the edge, preserving that light, coming in with variations of the color, more blue, and adding a little bit of contrast. And all of this, hopefully, with that sketching quality. As I also try to manage touches of technique, some wet on wet, some edges of shadow, some contrast. There we go. So very abstract, but the shapes of color that you managed to put in there, and I think it's time to change to a smaller brush. Just switch to a natural. And this is where you most likely would be using your favorite brush. So I'm probably going to be switching between these three. And I keep this a quill mop. A quill. It's a smaller one. A number 3 and a number 1 round for smaller details. And we are going to start seeing lots more variations to smaller and smaller broken brush strokes. Go back to that burnt sienna before it fully dries. Add touches, and we have some of those here. Understanding again how light. Need a little more of this color on my palette. Have that fresh granulation happen at that perfect magical moment. So the spectrum of color that I have going on here, there's not a lot of mixture. Now it's more, if you see this contrast that I created here, it's all through saturation. So it's just the same color with a higher amount of pigment. And that's definitely what he does. So I think this foot might be a little drier now. So I am going to mix a little bit of blue into this burnt sienna. Neutralize it just a little bit into the gray. And that will also make a difference between that and the shadows underneath. And I'm going to, again, just draw, sketch it in. The lines that we see between the toes. He really took his time here. Really took apart the light. But just that beautiful sketching quality. And it will, this is another layer, and I will come back. You could see he did the same thing as well. I need a tiny touch of that purple. Lower the value, and you see it just under here. A little tiny switch in temperature. More saturation, bringing in a little more blue, more pigment, and I'm going to neutralize it once again with just a tiny bit of the yellow. So it goes a little greener, gives us that sort of turquoise edge, but just a little bit more consistency to give us the shadow at the edge of the foot, taking it all the way along the side. Some of the color blends here at the bottom, but going back to that burnt sienna, just a touch. And into the heel. So very specific areas, and you see simplicity. I'm taking too much time with certain things. It's the way you set up the first layer and then bringing in these strokes, and they're just literally sketched on, and these are the ones here that just make it all happen. There's a tiny bit of value change and temperature change when you see it with some of the shadows. And you see one beautiful one with a little more yellow coming straight across the foot right here, where it gets a little less blue, a little more green, just at the top of some of these toes as they dry, and then here in the back. But you see the broken brush strokes. Then you see a little more shadow as the colors combine. So I'm doing a bit of both, mixing on the paper, mixing on the palette, and then bringing that wet on wet technique, wet on dry, wet on wet, with the softening of edges. And it's literally just these three colors: burnt sienna, cadmium yellow, and the ultramarine blue. And there's not much you need to do. The more you try to push these shapes, the more you get away from simplifying. And I think here, there's a beautiful area. It needs to be darker, just a bit darker in that shadow. So I'm going to add a little more ultramarine blue. Try to reach a level of the darkest gray I can get. And it's almost linear just at the base, just where the foot touches. Bring that over here too. And that's how you bring that contrast, and that's how you really just create volume. So yeah, when you do that sketching quality, it's not sketching. Sometimes it's understood as, well, it has to be fast, it has to be quick. Not necessarily. It needs to be confident. But with that level of confidence also comes a level of patience and understanding what needs to happen, when it needs to happen, in order for that final, to achieve the qualities, the techniques that you bring from your experience, that you know are the right answer to the problem. And it's sometimes conflicting with, well, if you say loose, loose means in some way sort of casual. Not necessarily. I bring it up and up over and over again. It's that looseness in the mind from the way you understand it. And in this case, understanding how these simple shapes come together, through light, through technique, through brushwork, and little by little, piece by piece, we add more edge, contrast, smaller and more complex pieces that complete the puzzle. So here I'm going back and forth from cool to warm. I want to be careful not to mix, not to bleed those colors. And as I reach that level of saturation, we begin to see it come together now in terms of volume. There we are. And for the technique that I attempted to do today, it will take lots and lots of layering. And although I used a heavier paper, it is taking a little longer to dry. But here, I want to give you one final look as I know how much longer this is going to take to complete. It's a beautiful palette. It's a little bit off from what Sargent was using, I feel. It's a little more turquoise. Mine is a little bluer because of the ultramarine. But if you see the blends and the layering, the early layering of those warm yellows and how they mix and blend on the palette or on the paper, and preserving the light, beginning to sharpen the contrast by saturation, pushing those colors a little more towards cooler and warmer, we begin to see how you achieve, little by little, a beautiful sketch.